transportation and supply chain make everything work. What's so obvious is how fragile everything really is. If trucks stopped moving, if there was no trucks to supply just the basic needs to the grocery store, as an example, it would take 3 days before there was nothing in the store for you to buy. If we don't see a change in our current trajectory, I do think the disruptions are going to get more profound. I think they're going to get more pronounced. And I think the general public is going to start seeing what we're experiencing now in a way that starts to change their expectations on what they can get their hands around in their normal day-to-day life. But at some point in time, if you can't get the drivers, if you can't fix the truck that breaks down, if you can't get tires, if you can't fix the windshield, everything else in the country is going to shut down, because unless it moves across the ground on a truck here in the United States, you're not going to get the product that you would expect to get at the store that you take for granted. Simple as that.
This week's special with Miles Franklin Precious Metal Investments. 2021 Silver Krugerrands for only $365 over spot. Call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We have a returning guest who hasn't been with us for almost 2 years. He is an insider in the trucking industry who has held a number of different positions within the industry, all the way from marketing and sales to dispatching, logistics planning, strategy, truck ownership, now fleet ownership, turning around companies from the management side, and even starting new companies. He's here with us again on Liberty and Finance to talk to us about what we can learn from the truth on the ground in the real economy and in the industry of trucking, and also how it's affecting individuals, not only truck drivers, their families, but also all of us who depend and rely on trucks and trucking to convey to us and from us the things that we need for our everyday lives. So, Trucking Industry Insider, thank you for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
Well, Donegan, thanks for having me back. Appreciate everything you're doing out there, and I'm certainly glad to be back to talk to the folks that you're reaching out to.
They've been very interested. You've been asked for several times, and it's been a long time brewing to get you back on here. It was very interesting. The time that we had you on last was at the very end of turning from 2019 into 2020. We were still, most of us had never even heard the term coronavirus or COVID. We just knew that we were being told by our president, Trump at the time, that we had the greatest economy ever. And yet we were being told by others, a study coming out of Harvard and other economists and so on, that there were early warning signs of that we were already entering a recession. And we asked you to help sort of sift the wheat from the chaff for us and tell us what was really going on the ground, as we could see from inside the trucking industry. I remember you telling us in that interview, and folks, there's a link to that interview in the description of this video. You can go back and refer to it. It's amazing. It has aged amazingly well. And a lot of the insights that you shared with us about what we were seeing, the name of the previous interview was Economic Red Alert from Inside the Trucking Industry. And that was the tone of it, was that as a leading indicator, the trucking industry was telling us that things were perhaps as worse, as bad off as they'd ever been, and that we were heading into tough times. There was very much the opposite of what we were being told from official sources. The official narrative was not at all that, and yet a lot of people were having severe concerns, grave concerns about the direction that the economy was heading. And we didn't know, but you helped us to see things that were going on from within the trucking industry that gave us, concrete examples of that. So could we take a three-step approach this evening and start out by talking about the broader economy? You left us off just on the verge. It was before the pandemic and all the lockdowns, all of that, but you were already telling us about huge structural weaknesses within the trucking industry and a real sort of attrition within that, trucks, drivers, companies, all kinds of casualties. So could you bring us quickly, sort of fast forward from there to today, what's happened over the past year and a half since we last spoke with you about the economy and how it's affected the industry?
So I guess just to kind of rewind and kind of go back to when we spoke, just at the beginning of 2019. So at that point, we were 4 or 5 months into, a downturn. And as I mentioned in that last talk, there's a parallel between where the economy's headed. And, from a trucking perspective, transportation always seems to feel the economic changes first. So, if we're on a downturn, we'll go through, usually 6-7 months of that before the general economy starts to feel the impact of that. And at the time, we just didn't know, was this going to be another cycle? Was it going to be similar to what we experienced back in 2008? Well, what ended up happening was that downturn continued to slide through all of 2019. The trucking casualties, those companies that couldn't withstand the economic impact of that, went out of business. Historically, so if you look at the number of trucking company failures, it was 2019 overall was the largest year in terms of the number of trucking company failures in a given year. As we continued into 2020. It ended up being the longest downslide, or the longest recession from a trucking perspective that we've seen. And the challenge with that is, you expect these cycles, right? So you have, your ups and your downs, you weather the storm. Typically worst case scenarios are 6-7 months long, and then you start to experience a little bit of recovery. You lose drivers during that period because drivers are nomadic, and they tend to think that, hey, I'm not getting the miles and the money that I've been used to, and it must be the company that I'm working with. So I'm going to move on to the greener pastures over here. Well, because of the length of time that all that took place, soon after, we spoke into, say, February, March, April, but then this downturn continued. Matter of fact, we didn't see the bottom of this downturn until right around the end of February of 2020. So some interesting timing. So as we approached March, we started to see small signs of recovery. So imagine, give or take September, October of 2018 is when things started to slide. We're now into February. In my 25, 27 years in the business, I've never seen a downturn last that long. And I do business with some colleagues that have been in the business for 45 years, and they would say the same thing, that they've never seen it last that long. And why does that even matter? Other than the fact that many of us were able to get through it, and unfortunately many of us were not, is that when something, if you have something that lasts 6-7 months versus something, in our case, coming out of 2018 October, so 18, 19, 20 months in, typically, the upswing has a similar effect. We call it a mirror effect. So if you got to have a 6-7 month downturn, you have a recovery time that takes 6 or 7 months to get you back up to the levels that you were prior to the downturn. So it's very concerning when you have something that lasts, 18, 19, 20 months, because, it took everything you had to survive that period of time because of the length of it. Knowing that now we're going to have, before we can get to the levels prior to that recovery, it's going to take approximately the same time. I mean, that's the way the cycles tend to work. So we're starting to make preparations, for basically almost a 2-year recovery period before we can get up to the levels that we were experiencing prior to October of 2018. Well, we get into March down again, and we started to see those signs of life. And then, of course, we know what happened in March of 2020, where, you just put some more nails into the coffin. And, if it wasn't for some of the economic recovery strategies under Trump's leadership, I think we, along with many of our colleagues, would have probably been out of business. So it was definitely a crazy time. Well, as far as COVID, and as far as the disruptions that COVID produced in the industry, from a transportation perspective, it really only lasted until, well, we didn't feel the effects of it until we got into April, because there's always a tail, behind changes and things that affect the industry, especially large things like COVID. Of course, there's not a lot of precedence there, but it was a nationwide change and impact. So once things really started to hit us in April, we were down for most of April, I guess most of May, and then towards the middle of June, when folks started going back to essential capacities, we started to see changes as far as positive changes and business starting to come back. And then, I guess fast forward till today, there's been a significant improvement from demand perspective from June of 2020 until today. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the more particulars as we get deeper into this. But it's from a recovery perspective, it's significant and it's improved significantly. However, most of it is somewhat on the artificial side because there's such a demand right now because of many shortages and things that we're experiencing on a day-to-day that I think from a trucking perspective, as we get into these details, we'll start to see, in the general public, like we just tend to do on both sides of this.
A couple aspects of the unusual situations that we've been through. You mentioned shortages of materials, and there are several questions submitted by viewers about that. Before we get to that, and it may be related to this, but that's just the general, you mentioned a national phenomenon. I guess taking it out to the global level, we've been told that there's been this huge dislocation of, for example, containers and container ships, all the containers being in the wrong places, so that there's just a lockup, a jam up in these complex global supply chains where, whether it's a semiconductor that has to be touched into 15 or 50 different countries in order to get all the way to where it needs to get to, or those kind of things where because of those rolling blackouts or rolling brownouts of lockdowns and so on between countries, and ships not being able to leave, ships not being able to dock and get unloaded, and trucks not being available to take the stuff, that there was just basically a global jam up of containers, cargo, and ships everywhere. Is that what you've sensed has been happening, and how has that affected the ability of loads being in the right places to be ready to move? So did that disrupt demand? And when demand comes back for trucking, how has that sort of dislocation and closing of the Canadian border, different things like that, people being able to not get to their jobs, how has that all impacted the ability of the industry to have things that need to be moved and to be able to move them from where they are to where they need to be?
Well, one of the things that we've seen accelerate probably over the last 6 months is demand. I guess let me put this in perspective. So if we rewind, just say till the beginning of 2021, as we came out of the year, there's a lot of unknowns leading up into 2021. With the various policies that were being implemented, how was it going to affect the day-to-day trucking? How was it going to affect the container pile up that's on most of the ports that you mentioned? How was some of the policies relating to unemployment and some of the additional unemployment funds that were being pushed out there? How is that going to affect employment? And as demand really started to kick in 2021, one of the things that became obvious, both to us, very, very, very close to us, in the inability to hire, that just continued to grow and exacerbate from an industrial perspective and a manufacturing perspective. So we had many of our customers telling us that, they have the demand and the orders and the things that would drive second and third shift production, but they didn't have the folks to fulfill those roles. And what we're hearing from our general manufacturing customer base is that there's somewhere between 30 and 40% of the capacity that they have demand for. And, from a trucking perspective, when there's such a customer demand and you have all these trucking companies that unfortunately weren't able to survive 2018 and 2019 and into 2020 as this pandemic, continued to kind of like hurt what was already down for such a long period of time, you all you do is hurt the shortage even more. Demand doesn't necessarily change, but your ability to fulfill those orders do. And I'll give you a quick example. You mentioned containers. I recently put together a presentation for our crew, just to give an idea of how things have changed since 2018. So in 2018, say October, because it would have been consistent back then, it was about $962 to move a container from Europe or Asia into one of the ports in the U.S. Dunnigan, any idea what that might cost you today to move?
No idea. I'll guess twice that.
$24,000.
Oh my gosh.
$24,000. So $962 in October of 2018, $24,000, it's September of 2021. I'll give you another example. Air freight. We move a lot of stuff into the U.S. from Europe. Air freight, from say Germany, would have cost you about $5 per kilo of freight coming over from Germany. 2021, it's $20, which if you do the math, that's about a 400% increase in cost to move it over from Germany. Another example, we do business with one of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturers in the world. They're having trouble finding not only raw materials, but some of their suppliers are having difficulty just hiring employees to run the production it takes so that they can get these just unfinished products so they can finish, building these agricultural pieces of equipment. They're sending employees to those tier one suppliers just so they can continue these lines moving, because they just can't hire the workers, to do what they need to do to move it.
Help me let's see if I can restate that to make sure I got that right. In the final assembly of big agriculture machines, like, I don't know, combines or whatever, can't happen because the parts aren't available. So those companies who would have been running their final assembly lines are instead redirecting their workforce out to their suppliers that would have supplied them the parts to help make the parts so that they can have parts to buy so that they can build what they're supposed to build in the first place.
That is correct. And we're seeing this across the board. Rates are at levels that none of us have ever seen. And this is just to fulfill a demand that, currently exists out there, but, it can't be fulfilled in a large way because of, so many of these disruptions that are taking place in the industry. And then you add to this, and you mentioned this chip shortage. We do a lot of manufacturing from a car perspective, from an automobile perspective. And, these are parts that move from plants to plants. Some are suppliers to the plant for, so they can wrap up the car, or supplier to supplier because they have to do different things to these parts. And, I don't know if you watched, heard this in the news yet, but GM just announced on Friday that they're going to shut down the majority of their North American manufacturing facilities all of this upcoming week, simply because they can't get these chips, and they won't be getting these chips, or the chips that they would love to have on hand, all the way probably up until the end of 2023 is what most of the talking heads seem to believe. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but this shortage is going to continue to shutter plants, and it's been happening all year long, and they're rotating these shutters. I don't know if you've been to a dealership lately, but
the lots are empty.
It looks, yeah, that's right. Correct. The lots are empty. You can't rent cars. I don't know if you tried to rent a car in a major city lately, but it's very difficult to do. And it's not going to get any better anytime soon. We're seeing this on a daily basis.
A few moments ago, you talked about the difficulty of getting drivers to show up for trucking companies, including those who are necessary to unload to take on containers from ports, that sort of thing, and move them. It sounds like a way of summarizing that, if I'm not mistaken, is that we're all having a lot of demand for stuff, but nobody wants to go and do the work to either make the stuff or move the stuff. There's some questions here from viewers about the shortage of drivers. One question is, this is from Jocko John, why is there a shortage of drivers if there are so many drivers needed? Out here in California, Long Beach, Los Angeles port, there's a never-ending stream of trucks 24 hours a day. Seems like there's plenty of drivers and trucks. But there's others that are asking about average age of drivers, number of drivers coming into the industry, how many are retiring, how many are replacing them, how many are hazmat, tanker endorsed, etc. So your assessment of the criticality of labor shortages, you already touched on it in manufacturing on the demand side, and the availability of semi-finished goods to move to satisfy that demand. What about within the trucking industry itself?
So this is a very complex question, Dunnigan. I guess to start, there's been a driver shortage for 15, 18 years, and growing. The average age of the trucker every year increases by a year, which from a statistical perspective, basically tells you that there's not a lot coming into the industry. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Trucking and being a truck driver, has never been thought of as a career move that would rank itself up with, what a college 4-year degree, might produce for you. There's one thing is for sure. There's been a lot of creativity within the trucking industry to try to find a way to bridge that gap. One of the things that has challenged us beyond, the normal challenges that you had year after year is that, when some of the economic policies that came out of Washington over the last, year or plus allowed 1099 workers to apply for unemployment benefits. That was something new. So for the first time, many of these truck drivers who are independent contractors, work as an independent LLC or they're not an employee of the companies that they're working for. So they're independent in many ways, both in the way they think and the way that they view, have their world view. They tend to be, a bit on the conservative side, as you see kind of in some of the media that, as it revolves around trucking and truck drivers, then especially the non-employee guys. When they had the ability to actually apply for unemployment benefits, some of these guys, and, I know that some of the questions that we went through in the last time that we talked, spoke about their wages and their ability to earn income. And certainly, in some ways, truckers, truck drivers, are kind of at the lower earning perspective, from economic averages, standpoint, unless they're in some of the specialized, trucking outfits. In our side, in our own little niche that we belong to, which is what's often referred to as the just-in-time or expedite niche of transportation or logistics, we're surrounded by these independent contractors, and their ability to earn income is very high if the demand is, sufficient enough to, maximize their earning potential. So if, when you take a 15 to 18 year run of struggling with bringing in qualified professionals in the industry, and the average age continues to go up, that means that the replacement rate is very low. And then add on top of that, allowing benefits in an area that never had benefits before, as it relates to, unemployment, all it did is make things a little bit worse, or in some cases, a lot of bit worse. Okay, so some of this disruption is centered around artificial shortages, right? And those artificial shortages, I guess they come from a couple different places. Raw material problems. So as we continue to import stuff into the United States, steel is a good example. This agricultural manufacturer I mentioned before. So they have plants all over the United States, right? And they are the global producer of these manufactured or agricultural equipment manufacturer. Okay, they are the number one. Okay, and they're having a difficulty bringing in simple things like steel to make the frames for this equipment that they manufacture, and that they've been manufacturing for years and years and years, but they're paying rates and they're paying an expedite company to move this steel. Okay, and to put this in perspective, imagine you're hiring a limo driver to bring your auto parts from the little auto parts store over to your business. So you're hiring a limo to do that, and that's essentially what's happening. And they're doing this because they don't have another option. The normal, slow boat transportation models, like your truckload and your LTL, these large companies. If you drive out on the highway and you see these company names every day that you drive, they're handling all these slower type of transportation modes that cost a lot less, and their bellies are so full that they can't help in this like I need it now, or what we call just in time logistics model. So they're desperate, right? So that gives you an idea on how difficult it is just for them to get their basic raw materials into their plants, so they can make their hoods, they can make their frames, they can make the basic things that go into making these products. And then go on, and then on top of that, Dunnigan. So so imagine this. So these trucks that are driving all over the United States in various modes, right? You got your tractor trailers, you got your straight trucks, you got these little cargo vans, right? You got the Amazon truck that's bringing you your products every couple of days, right? And so there's a ton of trucks all over the place, right? Well, these are mechanical pieces of equipment, and mechanical equipment breaks down. You need new tires. You hit something in the road, you need a new windshield. You have an airline that breaks, and you need some replacement parts, right? So one thing one thing of many that's been, I guess, plaguing us to just not only keep up with demand, but keep the truck on the road is this. A couple weeks ago, we entered into a nationwide shortage of truck windshields. And that might not sound to the layman like it's a big deal, but I can't tell you how many times we have to replace a truck windshield throughout the year. Probably to the tune of, say, 2 to 3 a year per truck. So something gets thrown up from a tire and hits the window. There's some DOT requirements that say, hey, listen, you have to replace this, when a certain crack in a window becomes a certain length, and if it's going to impede the driver's view, things of that nature. So, of course, you want to keep up on that. Nationwide shortage of windshields. We are just now entering into a nationwide shortage of truck tires. Okay. Well, depending upon the truck that you're talking about, they don't call it an 18-wheeler for nothing, right? So this poor 18-wheeler, is going to have to get new tires, probably give or take every 100 to 150,000 miles, which, tends to be anywhere from 12 to 24 months. We're experiencing an inability to replace certain tires and it's getting worse. Certain tires in certain sizes nationwide. We're experiencing anywhere from 3 to 4 times the amount of time to fix very common issues that go wrong on these trucks and trailers throughout the country. It seems like there's not an area around the country that isn't affected. And then go even further. Let's say we can get the drivers. Try to order a new truck to replace an old, an old unit that you would normally go through a cycle of replacement, which tends to be somewhere between 3 and 5 years. If you order a truck today, Dunnigan, you're probably not going to see delivery for that truck until somewhere between 6 and 9 months. And that's it if you get lucky. It could be as much as 12 to 18 if you're not. And that's today. And I really don't see that changing. Matter of fact, it's probably going to get worse from what some of the folks that I've been talking to have been telling me.
As you're describing this, I'm flashing back to an interview we did with Steve San Angelo from the SRS Rockwell Report. He talked about several documents and books and historical examples of the collapse of complex societies. He's talked to us about whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Europe, wherever it's in Africa, that you've had these incredibly centralized and complex societies with these empires, with these far-flung energy supply chains and that sort of thing. And then eventually they become fragile because of that and subject to any kind of disruption, whether it's natural disaster, whether it's foreign intervention, hostile, whatever, or with dissent from within or whatever, financial troubles. But that's extremely fragile. And what you're starting to describe here is like, okay, we can't get the workers for this reason. We can't get the loads in the right place for that reason. We can't finish these semi-finished goods for this reason and for that reason. We can't move the parts. If we can't move the parts, we can't make the finished goods. We can't make now we can't even build the trucks or repair the trucks we need to move all this other stuff. It almost sounds like there's a potential here for a vicious downward spiral, kind of a whirlpool that just pulls you down. We've all been told about a V-shaped recovery or a K-shaped recovery or an L-shaped recovery. This sounds like it could be just a slash, just on down. If you can't get the parts and you can't get the workers and you can't fix the things that are needed to move the parts, do you see this as potentially devolving or accelerating into a more serious setback than we've even seen so far?
Well, that's a big question, Dunnigan. Here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that there's first of all, I guess let me back up. Yes, fragility is absolute in not only our industry, but I think it shows how the supply chain, which connects everything together, right? So transportation and supply chain make everything work. What's so obvious is how fragile everything really is. And a lot of folks don't understand that, if trucks stopped moving, if there was no trucks to supply just the basic needs to the grocery store, as an example, it would take 3 days before there was nothing in the store for you to buy on as it relates to your normal everyday, expected goods that you buy at the store, your milk, your bread, your cheese, and so forth. So it is very fragile. And I think that if what we're experiencing right now, and I'm not a gloom and doom kind of guy, and I'm, certainly like, I'm a patriot, and I hope for the best for the country, and I hope that we can kind of climb out of what we're currently in. But if we don't see a change in our current trajectory, I do think that disruptions are going to get more profound. I think they're going to get more pronounced. And I think the general public is going to start seeing what we're experiencing now in a way that starts to change their expectations on what they can get their hands around in their normal day-to-day life. And if it doesn't get any better, I mean, from a financial perspective, it's good for us in the trucking world because demand is high. But at some point in time, if you can't get the drivers, if you can't fix the truck that breaks down, to your point, if you can't get tires, to replace the tire that blows out on the road, if you can't fix the windshield, you can't deliver the goods, and everything else in the country is going to shut down because unless it moves across the ground on a truck here in the United States, you're not going to get the product that you would expect to get at the store that you take for granted. Simple as that. Another
impact that is implied by what you're describing, and earlier you were talking to us explicitly about these astronomical increases in rates of freightage, across the ocean or across by air. What you're talking about here is, you say it's good for business because there's such demand, and so if there's scarcity of truckers or trucking, then you ostensibly could charge more potentially, as long as the market can bear it. But if these manufacturing plants start getting shuttered and that sort of thing, like you were describing, GM, others, then it can be we just had a Kenworth. Joe says microchip shortage. Kenworth just laid off 350 plant workers in Ohio as the build out of semis are sit waiting for them. Peterbilt also delayed new orders. So there's a couple aspects. One is, do you foresee or do you already have examples of this increase in cost of moving freight rippling into consumer prices, for example? Because the Fed keeps telling us, there's these temporary impacts, transient inflation that was caused just because of the COVID shutdowns, but that should be going away now. They've recently sort of backpedaled a bit from that, calling it transient inflation. That's the first question, is do you see evidence of, or do you believe that these increases in freight costs, for all these reasons you've mentioned, are going to have a sustained impact in prices of goods?
So I haven't seen it on the end user perspective yet, but I think that's coming. So I guess just put this in perspective. So the cost of goods to move across the ground from point A to point B here in the United States has increased by somewhere in the tune of 30 to 40%. Okay. So 30 to 40% of the cost to move something from point A to point B in the United States at unprecedented levels. I mean, it's inevitable that it's eventually going to end up into the consumer's, price of goods, at the cash register.
I guess that's an example of just the direct contributive cost of that as part of the cost of goods sold. I guess there's the other part that you mentioned earlier about just because of the lack of movement of goods, that causing scarcity of goods that we mentioned, cars or trucks in a dealer's lot, etc. So that would be a secondary, maybe even more dramatic impact on prices, is just that scarcity and a lack of availability of goods that are needed, parts that are needed, that sort of thing, can drive a increase in prices because of that as well. And it doesn't sound like you're seeing a turnaround yet. You're not seeing that normalizing.
I think you make a good point. You had mentioned, is there examples of it? So obviously we're seeing this from a car manufacturing perspective, right? So the reason you can't rent a car in some locales around the country is because they're program cars. And the manufacturers have stopped supplying the cars for these program cars, or these large companies that replace their fleet every year, every other year. So they're focusing specifically on the end consumer. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's a business decision, to get the best rate possible for the cars that you can sell. But try to get a discount right now on any vehicle that you're going to purchase from the lot. You're not going to see it. And, if you follow CSNBC, you follow Deloitte, you follow Bloomberg, they're all saying about the same thing. That over the next couple of years, the consumer don't expect when you buy a car to get any kind of rebate potential, get any kind of deal on these cars, because they're able to sell at retail rates. And until that changes, until this chip shortage changes, which a lot of folks seem to think that this is not going to end until sometime in 2023, because we get these things from overseas. And I have to admit, there's a couple manufacturers here in the U.S. that never, they didn't export chips from other countries. They continue to do this in the U.S. And Don, again, those companies that are doing that, they're continuing to manufacture. They're not producing a 98% product, sticking it on a lot somewhere. So once the chip comes in, they can finish it and actually get it out to the consumer. They're booming. They're fulfilling those orders, that are coming in right now. And this is another major manufacturer of heavy trucks, specifically it's in the transportation, I'll just say it. I don't know if it's okay. Is it okay to say?
Sure. Okay.
So Volvo and Mack trucks, they get these chips from U.S. manufacturers. and they continue to finish their products.
It's ironic. It sounds like in this last couple of decades, there's been this new wisdom, if you want to call it that in quotation marks, that the modern just-in-time zero inventory way was the smart way, and the holding inventory or insisting on domestic suppliers and that sort of thing, and not offshoring your supply chain, that sort of thing, was the old-fashioned, the dinosaur way, and you're going to be outmaneuvered and outrun and outperformed by this new smart competition. But back to Steve St. Angelo's comment from the SRS Rocco report saying, beware over complex systems in general, the fragility of over complex systems. And here's the old school way of, building things out of things you can source locally and domestically, and not keeping your supply chain too complicated, but also, or carrying inventory, actually having a supply, a emergency stock that's deeper than just a couple days or couple hours for some of these manufacturing plants was considered, baggage, excess baggage, and too much cost. Smart operators would cut that out. You get raises and bonuses if you figured out how to cut down to lean. It sounds like maybe we're going to see some winners and losers here through the survivor list here of those who have a stockpile, or those who have an inventory and those who don't, those who had extended long supply chains and those who had shorter supply chains. And I can't help but think about reluctant preppers that we've been doing here since 2013, where the smart young generation has been told through every chance of the narrative, that you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. You don't need real money. You don't need to have a garden. You don't need to have a pantry, a larder full of food in your basement. You don't need to have a cistern full of water, or even a swimming pool full of water, or live by where there's water. You can live in the middle of the desert in a metro area. You can live in a huge city high rise. Don't worry. There's plenty of food at the shopping center. There's plenty of air at the mall. You don't need to have anything on hand. But then when there's a disruption in that whole system that assumes everything's perfect all the time, all of a sudden the people who do have a stockpile, who do have a supplies, may be ending up the survivors. It sounds like that's happening perhaps at a company level here. It sound like those manufacturers you mentioned are probably thriving when others might not be able to weather this storm.
Well, we have this idea that seems to be built into us that, this is all going to get worked out. We're going to get to the other side of it. It's not going to be that bad. It's not going to be the worst case scenario, this Pollyanna view. And, generally speaking, if you look at it from a historical perspective, it seems to go that way. This works out and we'll move on to another cycle. But what's been obvious since 2008 is that these cycles that we've been going through have been unique and unprecedented at each level, right? And it seems like the challenges that continue to come our way, although we're pretty nimble, we figure out how to get through them. If it's a driver shortage, we figure out how to use other carriers' drivers, and if it's a shortage in raw materials, we find another country, or we try to work that into the United States and bring it back home, and so we can hopefully at least not deal with the border perspective that tends to muddy up the waters. But what's changing and what seems to be ever present is that not only is it fragile, like we mentioned, but it's certainly we're in uncharted territory on so many levels, and being hit by so many different variables that the predictability in our business is pretty much out the window. And we're like constantly in survival mode. And you made the point, and so did I, that things are good from a trucking perspective because demand is high. But as you enter into all these factors that we foresee us getting hit with more and more and getting worse and worse, I mean, I don't know where this is going to go. None of us can predict it anymore, and that makes it very difficult, to make decisions to help the company weather the future storms. It's turned us into like, let's survive this month and see what next month brings us. And we'll see what we have to do then. And we just continue to go through this process month after month, which is different than we've ever seen.
I have the feeling, again, you mentioned way back when we interviewed you almost 2 years ago that the trucking industry is a leading indicator for the rest of the economy. I'm getting that feeling right now at this moment in the conversation, because everything you're describing, I can extrapolate into the individual household, the ordinary family, that how are we going to weather the storm? How can we predict what's going to come next? The tricks we've used in the past don't seem to be working. So we're going to have to take this, a step at a time. But most households, just like perhaps most trucking companies, I believe are woefully underprepared to handle that kind of disruption and flexibility and versatility, because we've been, as you mentioned, lulled into a kind of this normalcy bias of thinking things generally go well. We'll just kind of bounce back from this because everybody will just do what they need to do and we'll go back to being productive again. But it sounds like there are many, many factors that most people aren't considering that are weighing on our ability to do that bounce back, and that we may see, severe, protracted swings, volatility, lockups, shortages, delays, unpredictability, price spikes, etc. Too much stuff in one place, not enough stuff in another place, etc. for some period of time here. I have to say, it reminds me of when we visited a complex system. The ride Test Track at Walt Disney World came out, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, and everybody wanted to go on it, and it was supposedly really cool. But boy, how many times you got in line and the whole thing just stopped and locked up, and they said, "Oh, sorry, it's down. We're rebooting the whole thing." Because even when something's all jammed up inside, if you stop, you can sometimes start the whole thing up from a level you can support if you can't sustain the level you were at, the velocity, the traffic, the everything. So I'm just wondering how many of those lurches to a significant decline of overall throughput in the economy or in industry or in transportation or whatever we may suffer before we can sort of grind our way back to sort of rebooting this economy, and what lessons we'll have learned along the way. I think for reluctant preppers, there's a lot of food for thought in what we've talked about. I see that we're up against the clock, and we haven't even got to the section where we're talking about truck drivers themselves, how the impact on their families, whether they're going to strike or not, that sort of thing. Wondering if we could plan to get you back on real soon, because we got a whole bunch more, dozens more viewers' questions we'd like to get to. Wonder if we could just give you a time for any last parting thoughts that you have for people on your sort of, I guess, your biggest takeaways of this last year and a half and the next period ahead as you see it.
So let me leave you with this, Dunnigan. If I was giving you advice or giving any folks advice that are out there and they're listening to what we're talking about, and if there's any truth, which I wholeheartedly believe, that a lot of the economic conditions that everyone experiences on the day-to-day, start in our world of logistics. I think that folks need to start preparing for disruptions far beyond what they've experienced in the last year and a half. And I think I really do believe that there's going to be some challenges ahead that are going to be born out of our inability to, produce the products that are in demand, and maybe worse. So I guess where I'm going with this is I think that based on what we're experiencing right now, that the disruptions that the general public are going to start to experience are going to be real. It's going to be important, and it's going to be a challenge. And I think the challenges that we've experienced over the last year, may pale in comparison if you can't get the things that you expect to get on a day-to-day basis.
It's interesting how much what you're saying echoes things we've heard from completely different spheres. Talking with Joel Salatin, a teaching and activist farmer and writer from the Shenandoah Valley in West Virginia at Polyface Farms, he talks about, in Virginia and in Polyface Farms, he talks about needing to get our food security figured out now. that's one of many critical topics that we'll be addressing more. We're going to be instituting a weekly sort of a renaissance of our Reluctant Preppers theme here on one day per week, because it seems like that's coming more to the fore again and needing to get attention. We're grateful that you're in our corner and that we can tap your expertise and your insight and your awareness. You're plugged in, and we need that advanced warning system. So thank you for being there on behalf of all of our viewers here at Liberty and Finance. Yeah,
my pleasure, Duncan. And in a large way, I hope I'm wrong on a lot of this stuff, but I suspect that I'm not. And, I'm sure we'll be talking more about these, the driver perspective. I'd love to drill into that a little deeper.
Very good. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Donegan. Thanks for having me.
This week's special with Miles Franklin Precious Metal Investments. 2021 Silver Krugerrands for only $365 over spot. Call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.